Hi, class. Last time we talked about the Puritans, and today we're going to look at another important settlement by the British in North America, and that is Virginia. Uh, this settlement of Virginia wasn't motivated by religious freedom or for religious tolerance. It wasn't motivated by any felt need to escape the old world to find freedom or any such noble goal. The stimulus for this American settlement was primarily for profit. Expecting to profit from Western colonization, as the East India Company had in India, a group of merchants and wealthy gentry set up a joint stock company that was called the Virginia Company, or sometimes the London Company, in 1606. It proposed to found a settlement in North America and produce gold. Everybody knew there was gold there. Richard Hakluyt had said, there's gold anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And so the purpose of the original settlement in Virginia by the Virginia Company was to produce gold and export it back to the mother company. Now, the Virginia Company was a joint stock company. Joint stock companies had been developed in England sometime in the 15th century as a mechanism for pooling resources of a large number of investors in order to raise capital for some kind of entrepreneurial activity, usually trade somewhere in Europe or even in Russia. A good example is a company called the Muscovy Company that would, every so many years, would start up in England. They would sell stock and raise capital. They would use that capital to purchase ships and to purchase goods, English goods, and then they would go to Russia. And there they would sell those goods and purchase amber and furs and other stuff that the Russians had. So this model of a joint stock company had been extremely successful in creating short-term entrepreneurial schemes, activities, usually involving trade. The investors would see a rapid return and a very profitable return for the stock that they had invested in. No one person risked too much money. After all, this was a pretty risky venture. And so the returns more than paid for the risk. But joint stock companies turned out to be a very poor way to finance colonies because the early settlements required enormous amounts of capital and often didn't return much in the way of immediate profit. The colonists founded by joint stock companies accordingly suffered from a chronic lack of capital. This was because investors didn't want to reinvest having lost on the previous investment. They didn't want to throw good money after bad. And also because there was a constant tension between the stockholders in Britain who wanted to see a return on their investment and the colonists who believed that they had a right to keep the fruits of their labor. After all, they had made the trip. They had been the ones who had taken all the risks. They were the ones who worked to grow products. So they believed that it was really rather unfair to pay off a bunch of stockholders in London who hadn't really done more than invest a little capital. The Virginia Company presents a pretty good piece of evidence for the long-term failure of joint stock companies as colonizers. It was chartered by King James I in 1606. The company tried but failed to start a colony in Maine and barely succeeded in planting one in Virginia. In 1607, it dispatched 144 men and boys to North America. Ominously, only 104 of them actually survived the voyage. In May of that year, they established a settlement called Jamestown on a swampy peninsula on a river they also named after the king, the James River. The colonists were ill-equipped for survival in an unfamiliar environment, and the settlement was immediately afflicted by dissension and disease. By January of 1608, only 38 of the original colonists were still alive. That's a survival rate of about 20%. Many of the first migrants were gentlemen and professional soldiers who were unaccustomed to working with their hands. After all, these were gentlemen, and for them, work only happened to other people. There were also specialists who were just about as irrelevant as the gentlemen. They had skills like glass making and jewelry making to employ all that gold, and watchmaking. Having come to Virginia expecting to make easy fortunes, most of the settlers could not adjust to the conditions that they encountered. They resisted living, quote, like savages, they retained their English dress and casual work habits despite desperate circumstances. Such attitudes, combined with the effects of chronic malnutrition and epidemic disease, took a terrible toll. The survivors began bickering among themselves, but still didn't do any of the necessary work that had to be done to create a survivable colony. The settlers refused to do the necessary manual labor required for their survival, like planting food and finding clean water. They were gentlemen, after all, and proper English gentlemen didn't do that sort of thing. It became necessary for the group leader, Captain John Smith, to impose martial law on the settlement and force his reluctant comrades to do the work that was necessary for their own survival. Smith and some of his military friends who were in the settlement essentially staged a coup, enforced martial law on the settlement, and forced the settlers to do the necessary chores. Smith posted a sign in the colony that stated, "Who does not work does not eat." Relations with the most powerful native tribe in the area got off to a good, but if rather confusing start. This tribe consisted of a large group of Algonquin speakers who had recently moved into Virginia from somewhere north, probably western New York, and had conquered the smaller tribes in the area in order to set up a sort of an Algonquin empire. When Captain John Smith visited and presented gifts to their chief, Powhatan, the chief assumed that Smith was giving him tribute, and the chief extended his protection to the English while expecting them to help him defeat some of his more troublesome local enemies so that he could further expand his empire in Virginia. Smith compounded this agreement by actually doing so. After 1620, relations between the Algonquins and the colonists became strained when Powhatan died and his brother became chief. The Powhatans and the Virginia colonists fought a series of wars with each other. By 1650, warfare and disease had all but destroyed the Algonquins. leaving the English as the dominant group in Virginia. It became fairly clear, fairly quickly, that there was no gold in Virginia. Investors realized that the only way they would ever see a return on their investment would be to produce some kind of profitable cash crop that might be produced in Virginia and exported to England. The crop would be tobacco. Now, tobacco already existed in Virginia. The native peoples produced a very, very strong and harsh brand of tobacco. Europeans wouldn't buy it. But John Rolfe made a raid on a Caribbean island, a Spanish colony in the Caribbean, and he brought back with him a sweet variety of Spanish origins in 1611. It grew well in Virginia and quickly became popular in England and elsewhere in Europe, I should mention. By 1620, Virginians exported 40,000 pounds of cured tobacco to Europe. 10 years later, by 1630, they were exporting 1.5 million pounds. In the 1620s, a visitor to Jamestown reported that every square foot of cultivatable land in Virginia was planted with tobacco. People even grew it in the streets of Virginia towns and in the countryside. Some of the leaders of the colony began to worry that the colony was growing so much tobacco to the exclusion of anything else, Virginians would starve because they were neglecting to grow corn and other necessary foods. Now, tobacco culture is an extraordinarily labor-intensive form of agriculture. So as the number of plantations expanded in the 1640s and 50s, it became increasingly difficult to get enough immigrants, to get enough colonizers or colonists to plant tobacco, to work. The planters needed laborers. Virginians needed a way to bring in more labor. This was tough because it was reasonably well known by this stage in the game that despite the tempting lies produced in travel books, the survival rate for new colonists was very, very low indeed. So Virginians developed a system called the headright system. The company promised that it would give each family member 50 acres of land. So if you go with a wife and 2 kids, you'd get 200 acres of land. The offer was very appealing to poor and especially displaced Englishmen and English tenant farmers. They could never expect to own land and the prestige that political rights that went with it in England. So the Virginia Company was essentially selling them not only land, but social mobility in return for their labor. Now, the problem was getting to Virginia. Most folks simply couldn't afford the passage. And if they could afford to buy tickets, to buy passage to Virginia, the chances were they were well enough off that they weren't going to be interested in going. But there was a process they could go through. They could go to a ship's captain and they could create a contract between the ship's captain and themselves. Now, this contract is called an indenture. And what the indenture did was it promised usually 7 years of labor to the holder of the contract in return for passage to Virginia. So you go to a ship's captain, you fill out a contract, you put your X on it, and he will now take you to Virginia. Now, He's not interested in your labor, but the Virginia planters are. So when he gets to Virginia, when the captain gets to Virginia, he auctions off the indentures to people who need labor. And the new immigrant would then have to serve the indenture holder, the planter, for 7 years before he would be free. And of course, once free, they could claim their head right. They could get their land. Now, the head right turned out to be sort of a myth that was used to get people to America because there was so much available land there that all a person had to do once they had finished their indenture was go west a few miles and create a plantation of their own. Thousands of English families were willing to take the risk. For many, in the early period of Virginia settlement, the risk paid off big time. And some of the greatest planter families came from the humble beginnings of indentured servitude. Now, the Virginia Company did not fare very well. Although after 1616, the planters in the colony began to prosper, in 1620, the Virginia Company itself was bankrupt. In 1623, the company folded up. James I decided that the Virginia colony was far too profitable to him because of revenues from tobacco sales. So rather than leave the colony sort of alone to its own devices, King James created a royal colony in Virginia. Now, Virginia had been governed by the company in London and by a colonial council and assembly. After 1624, the king would appoint a governor, usually English, and a council, usually made up of the most important Virginia planters, and the freeholders of Virginia elected their assembly, the House of Burgesses. So the Virginia colony passed relatively painlessly in 1625 from a company colony to a royal colony. Over the next 60 years or so, Virginia became more socially stratified and more like old England, just as Massachusetts had. Whereas Massachusetts society followed an English urban and merchant pattern, Virginia followed the pattern of English rural planters called the gentry. As the earliest planters acquired more and more land, they began to resemble the great landed country gentry of England. Newer arrivals were able to create small farms on the periphery of the great estates and came to resemble the small freeholders, the yeoman farmers of England. By 1700, all of the great families of Virginia were well established. Families like the Byrds, the Burvilles, the Carters, and the Lees, and so forth, were all great plantation families by 1700. By 1700, there were fewer and fewer Englishmen who chose to immigrate to Virginia. The traditional means of rising to wealth in Virginia were no longer possible. Traditionally, the best way to join the planter aristocracy was to marry a rich widow. Women in Virginia could expect to outlive at least 2 and sometimes 3 husbands. But by 1700, the great planter families were well enough established that they tended to marry only within their own class. Also by then, the life expectancy for men was generally longer, and the mortality rate was much better than it had been in the 1600s. These great planter families tried very hard to recreate English country society within Virginia. Their society more closely resembled an idealized squirearchy than a nobility or an aristocracy. In spite of their behavior, though, the great Virginia tobacco planters still were definitely aristocrats in Virginia. They were not a nobility because nobility is a condition of blood. One must be born into a noble family. But these powerful planters were aristocratic nevertheless. They took the attitudes of the great squires of 18th century England and they believed that rich, well-born, and able were synonymous. They believed in noblesse oblige, the best and brightest, which meant, of course, the richest and most fortunate, should govern for the benefit of all. Members of this planter aristocracy believed in representative government, but they believed that the role of a representative was not to reflect the will of the people, that is, what 50% plus one of the voters wanted, but to do what they felt was in the best interest of the people, the public good. They viewed the freeholders as a, quote, vulgar herd. That's a phrase, by the way, that Thomas Jefferson used, and could never have informed ideas about politics. The vulgar herd could never have informed ideas about politics, and certainly could not be trusted to govern themselves. The commonality, as opposed to the quality, made decisions with their stomachs and hearts, their interests and their passions, and not their heads. They were capable of maintaining disinterested politics, so the duties of government had to be left up to their betters, the planter aristocracy. In Virginia, political selection, note, not election, went like this. Candidates did not actively seek office. To do so was crass and unfitting the humility and modesty of a gentleman. They were called upon by their friends to run for office, and if they reluctantly agreed, their friends nominated them for election. Then, having agreed with a heavy heart, the candidate withdrew from politics. He sat on his porch and watched the world go by. He didn't make stump speeches. He didn't get involved with the electorate. His friends did that for him. His friends campaigned. They gave great treats, essentially barbecues or picnics, for their candidate. Now, these treats were most notable for the massive quantity of rum consumed on the spot. George Washington's friends, for example, gave a treat for 391 voters in his county, and they consumed 160 gallons of rum, nearly 2 quarts each, on the spot. The small freeholders, the vulgar herd in Virginia, expected to defer to the Virginia gentry, to the planter aristocracy. Their only choice on election day was generally whether to vote for a candidate allied with one great wealthy family or another, if there even was more than one candidate. Voting requirements were fairly loose. In general, if you owned some farmland or a small city plot and you were an Anglican, and were, of course, adult, male, and free, you could vote. But even the rules on landholding and religion were not always strictly enforced. In most cases, the voting body of Virginia included all adult males who owned some property. Elections were held by voice vote, and were usually in order of social importance. For instance, in Lord Fairfax County, now Fairfax was the only real hereditary nobleman who actually resided in Virginia, he always voted first. Then any other important planters who resided in the county came in right behind him, and then the Anglican pastor voted, and then militia officers and so forth, all the way down the social ladder to the very smallest freeholder, who might even technically not qualify to vote, but who would be the one who would be dishonorable and tell him he couldn't. All of the voters generally voted for whomever Fairfax supported. Often in districts like this, where there was one planter of great importance, like Lord Fairfax, there was only one candidate. To run against Fairfax's choice would be impertinent and disrespectful. It would border on dishonorable. Now, Virginians only voted for one candidate, that is, for one position, their representative in the House of Burgesses. Compare this to other colonies. For instance, Rhode Island voted annually for 2 legislators, a governor, justice of the peace, town councilmen, constables, and so forth, all the way down to a fellow who was called the viewer of butter in firkins. He would go from town to town and farm to farm, testing the quality of butter. Virginians had very different ideas about what constituted good government. They saw the Northeast as dangerously democratic, and of course New Englanders believed that Virginians were dangerously aristocratic. But the most effective political power in the Virginia colony was the House of Burgesses. Gradually, this became true in other colonies as well, as assemblies that represented the freeholders of the colony gained greater and greater power. Finally, let's take a look at the church in Virginia. Now, the established church of the Virginia colony, like the established church of all the southern colonies for that matter, was Anglican, the Church of England. But Virginian Anglicanism drifted over time to come to resemble, in some ways, New England's Congregationalism. Effective control of each Virginia parish church was in the hands of the vestry. Vestrymen were the most important members of the church who met to decide important issues within their parish. They were usually members of great planter aristocratic families. The ministers of Anglican churches in Virginia were appointed by the Bishop of London. The colonies had no bishop, and so the Bishop of London was in charge of the Anglican Church in the Americas. The British government would send whoever the bishop chose to their church in Virginia. If the vestryman liked him, he was selected to be the minister of the parish church. He was effectively tenured in that church and would serve for life. But the final step in his placement was that the vestry had to send a letter to the Bishop of London accepting the new minister. The letter would say, Reverend so-and-so has arrived at our parish, and he is now practicing as the local minister. Over time, the vestryman stopped sending the letter. What that meant was these new ministers never received any kind of tenure, and in fact, they could be fired at the discretion of the vestry. If a minister's sermons were too long, terrible thing in Virginia because there was much to do. There were picnics and races and so forth to attend. If the sermon went too long, then he might be fired. If he was critical of slavery, then he would certainly be fired. If he was critical of wealth, for instance, he gave a short sermon on the biblical passage that says it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven, well, he would certainly lose his job. If he kept his sermons short and didn't poach on anything that upset the local planters, he was kept on. If not, he would be out of a job. So as Massachusetts drifted toward an enforced orthodoxy and a hierarchical church structure, rather like the Anglicans, so Virginia Anglicanism became less hierarchical and more congregational. By the beginning of the Revolution, there existed a fairly broad consensus of what American Protestantism should look like, regardless of the particular sect, and to some extent even regardless of the particular colony. By 1763, Virginia was a long way from the expectations of its founders. It was very like rural England, with great aristocrats and squires, the various planters, and a large body of yeoman farmers, small farmers, English freeholders, if you will. As was the case in England, the largest share of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few great landholders who governed with the support and the deference of the smaller freeholders.